How are you? Sorry I haven't been around lately. I made a few videos before, but by the time I came to releasing them, it just didn't quite feel right, so I didn't release them. So, anyways, this one came up and I thought it was time to release it, and so I hope it's important to you. The message is essentially the importance of a testimony. Now, testimony is a very nuanced terminology. You may or may not have heard of it. And for instance, Mormons or the LDS will say that testimony is essentially your belief deep down in your soul that the Book of Mormon is true. That is not a testimony. That is acid reflux. A testimony is really your path to God, your path to knowing that God is true, your path to your path of maturity of how God has led you from where you were to where you are now. You got this. And so I want to kind of talk to you about that because in this day and age, he's been a little mischievous. In this day and age, it's going to be more important than ever, especially with the way governments are working, how politicians are being a lot worse than they used to be. And it's important to really be able to lean on your testimony. So, before we start, let's take a look at a few images. If you're just listening to this, you may have to actually look at your phone. But these are a couple memes of when you lie on your resume. And for those of you in England, a resume is your CV. It is your work history. It is your experience and path to where you are and where you want to go. It's what you present to your future employer to show why they should pick you over other people. So, knowing your CV or knowing your resume is important. And to illustrate that, I just made a little stinker. To illustrate that, we're going to talk about a story. In this story, you could find in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And I recommend you read it so you could really understand this passage entirely. Hey, no, stay. So, the book of Samuel, essentially, you have the prophet Samuel, but the people of Israel don't want the prophet because the prophet was seen as the king, if you will, although he wasn't a king, he was a spiritual leader, and they wanted a physical leader. They wanted someone similar to what other countries have got, and they wanted a person to represent them. They had a initial leader called Saul, but he quickly fell out of favor with God. And so God told Samuel, the prophet, to go to a town in a city of Judah and anoint a new king. So he goes to this house. Now, this character that we're going to talk about, everyone kind of knows about. Everyone has heard of David and Goliath. Goliath was a real person. David was a real person. In fact, recently, recently they have excavated the town that Goliath came from, and they've been able to find what they presume was Goliath's house and the city gates, rooms, etc. And it's like kind of a fascinating find. There's a lot of assumption that goes into that, but it is still interesting nevertheless. But before all that, Samuel goes to his house, and God says, "Go into his house, and you will anoint your king." And so it's kind of like the story of Cinderella, where the stepsisters are trying to fit the shoe on their big feet, and Cinderella's locked away in a room somewhere. It's kind of a similar kind of situation where David is the runt of the litter. He's the youngest of the sons, and he is out tending the sheep. And so when this prophet comes, the dad goes and he gets all the sons minus David. And to be fair, they figured David was a nobody, and they would pick the older sons because, they're taller, handsomer, stronger, etc., etc. And, why wouldn't he? Well, when Samuel was in front of the sons, he kept going. God kept saying, "Nope, not that one. Nope, not that one. Nope, not that one." And at the very end, he says, "Do you have any more sons?" And they said, "Well, we have one more, but he's really nobody. He's out in the fields tending to sheep." He says, "Well, bring me that son." So they quickly go out, find the son, and bring him the son. And Samuel says, "That's the one." He pours oil on top of his head and anoints him as king of Israel. Now, David had enough respect for the monarchy that he didn't try to overthrow King Saul. He didn't try to kick him out. He knew that he was anointed, but he didn't dare step on any toes until he knew that Saul was dead. And so he kept doing what he normally did. He kept tending to sheep. And then fast forward to the Battle of Goliath. And essentially what happens is all of David's brothers, of course, they're conscripted to the Israeli army, while David is still tending to a sheep. And at that time, David's father comes up to David and says, he gives him some bread and he gives him some wine. And he says, "Give this bread and wine to your brothers." And so David gets all excited, realizing he could ride out to see the battle. And he goes out, finds the Israeli army in this big valley. And the entire Israeli army is scared crap. They're scared out of their mind, and essentially have Goliath on the other side of the valley taunting them and yelling at them, basically saying, "Send me your champion and I will fight them." And what he's proposing is whoever loses the fight, the entire army will become slaves to the winners. And King Saul's hiding behind rocks, and all the fighting men are hiding behind rocks because they are scared shitless of fighting Goliath. To be fair, Goliath, according to the Bible, was said to be around 9 feet tall and was a warrior since his youth. And so it is understandable how he could be quite formidable and people would be afraid to fight him. And so, as it were, nobody dared step out on the field to fight him because they realized, A, they'd likely die, And B, when they likely die, everyone else will become slaves. And that was something that they just couldn't fathom doing. So here comes young David. He sees what's going on, and he just is feeling just enough arrogance to really think, hey, how dare Goliath say what he's saying and doing what he's doing? I'm going to go fight him. And King Saul is so stunned by this. He says, you're just a boy. And David says, well, while tending my father's sheep, when the lion attacked my sheep, I fought off the lion. When the bear came after my sheep, I fought off the bear. And he goes and is essentially laying out his resume before the king, saying, I have done this, I have done that, God has rescued me from this, God has rescued me from that. And King Saul eventually gives in and says, okay, if you're suicidal enough to go fight him, I'll let you go fight him. But he offers him his own shield and sword and armor. And so David tries to put on the shield and armor, but Saul was quite a bit bigger than David. It's kind of assumed that David was kind of shorter in stature. But David tried putting on armor, and he could not carry it. Skittles, no. He tried putting on the armor, but he couldn't quite fit it. And so David takes off the armor and goes into battle without it. And then he goes, finds a couple rocks, and takes a sling, and as the story goes, he loads a rock into a sling, shoots it at the Goliath, and he falls over dead. Now, to be fair, we should really kind of look at YouTube videos where people are actually shooting rocks and slings, and you could really do some damage if you really know what you're doing. But that being said, nobody expected David to win, except maybe David, and nobody expected Goliath to lose, but he did. He brought in his testimony. He brought in his resume. He knew what God was going to do because he knew from past experience how God has rescued him, how God has saved him, and how God has delivered him from things like lions and bears and other natural enemies. And so, what does that have to do with you? Everything nowadays is being very politicized. Everything is being very unique. Just the other week, there was a big article how there's like 70 Christians who were beheaded in Africa, or could have been like Ethiopia, or anyways, there's like 70 Christians who were beheaded just for being Christian. I know in England right now, there's a problem with people being arrested for simply praying where they shouldn't be praying, or saying what they believe on social media. And people are afraid to speak up. People are afraid to step up and really share their faith. Now, this kind of brings us to another story, the story in Daniel. In the book of Daniel, you don't have to go that far as far as reading it. I believe you could kind of get the gist of it within the first 2 or 3 chapters. But in the book of Daniel, this was right after the Babylonian conquest, where the Babylonians came in and defeated Israel and took people from Israel into Babylon as slaves. And so you have Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, in this story, which was actual real people, real events, they were instructed to worship before this bronze statue, or I think it's a golden statue. And the golden statue was of the King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, in this situation, they said when they hear music playing, everybody within the kingdom, big and small, has to bow down before this idol. The idol is, once again, the king. These people, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, publicly stood out and refused to bow before this statue. And so what happens? These people get dragged up in front of the king, and they say, "May the king live forever, but we will never bow before the statue." And King Nebuchadnezzar gets so irate that he goes and he heats up his furnace, and he heats it up 7 times hotter than it normally is. And he orders his guards to throw these 3 men into the furnace, all bound up. And the Bible says that the furnace was so hot that the guards throwing them into the furnace perished due to the heat. But minutes later, after throwing the 3 men into the furnace, the king, looking from afar, sees the men not only alive, but walking inside the furnace. But what's even more disturbing is when he looks deeper, he sees not 3 people, but 4 people inside the furnace. And he asks his guards, "Didn't we send 3 people in?" And he said, "Yeah, we sent 3 people in. So I see a 4th, and it looks like an angel." Or he specifically says it looks like the Son of God. So he cries out to the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to come out of the furnace. So they come out, and it says that they didn't even smell like smoke. None of their hair was singed. They were perfectly healthy and preserved. And it was with these people, they had the confidence, they had the testimony that God was going to save them. Before they were thrown into the furnace, they said, "We will not bow down before your statue, and we believe that God is going to save us. But even if he doesn't, we still will only serve him and worship him." You know, it's one of those things where we need to have the conviction of what we believe. It's easy to coalesce. It's easy to compromise. It's easy to come up with reasons why we shouldn't stand up against authority, when we shouldn't say things that would ruffle feathers, like my bird here. It's really easy to really go into hiding and play it safe. But this is the time that we need to stand up the most. So it's because of that, I wanted to give you this quick message, something where you could really think about how God's helped you. Think about how God has provided for you over the years. And if it's one of those things where you're not even sure how God has helped you, it's something that I challenge you to really contemplate. You know, it's easy to pray and then wonder, has anything ever happened? You know, one thing that people recommend is pray and keep a journal. write down what you pray about and check back in a week or 2 or 3 and see if many of those things haven't been actually taken care of while you completely forgot all about them. There are times where we easily look back at our lives and think, oh, things are just coincidence. Things really, we just had good luck. And sometimes we just don't really give God the glory of what He has done in our lives. For instance, I met my wife halfway across the world. How does that even happen? And this is not even like now where you could find a friend of a friend of a friend on Facebook. This was all before any of that was around. Last year, our bird died, and we were praying about that. And God, at least I felt, spoke to me that we would get a new bird. And we get our bird, and we get him halfway across the country in Florida. And not just that, he is flown to us cheaper than it would be if we even drive out there to get him ourselves. How does that even work? By the time we found out about him and everything kind of went into place, it was all smooth sailing from there. He took care of all the details. When we got our dog Oscar, both our dogs had died. I think we had one dog at the time, but we weren't even looking. We saw this dog that we were looking for on Facebook a fraction of the cost that we paid any of our dogs in the past. And less than 24 hours from the time that we saw him on Facebook, he was at our house. How does this even happen? It's easy to look at these kind of things and say, oh, they're coincidences. Oh, they're just good luck. But really, when you look at it, realize how God's orchestrated everything. How He orchestrated our bird to be born even before our previous bird had died. Allowed him to be fully feathered to survive the flights, to be weaned, and ready to go at the time that we are ready to get him. That took a lot of forethought and foresight to make that happen. Same with Oscar, our dog. He made it happen. And even with my wife, I met her a few months earlier. She may or may not have been ready for a relationship. Or she may have been in another relationship. Or if I met her a few months later, same thing. Everything happened just perfectly within His timing, and everything just fell into place. There's a famous story where I believe it was out in the bush in Africa. These missionaries were out there, and it was in the middle of winter, and people were really getting sick, and they just ran out of medicine. And the doctors and all the missionaries and everyone realized things were dire. They needed medicine, and in particular, a girl was dying in the village because her immune system was shutting down, and she needed a specific medication. She needed a hot water bottle because she couldn't stay warm. And people were pretty sure that she was going to pass away within that week. And this town was one of those towns where they would get mail maybe once a week. And so all the villagers got together and they prayed to God. And they had this other little girl pray on their behalf because they were running out of faith. And this little girl prays and she says, please send medicine our way. And please send a hot water bottle for this child who is dying. And also, can you send teddy bears so she could be comforted and know that she's loved? Now, keep in mind, to get mail there would take months in advance for it to happen because they were in such a remote location. Well, sure enough, the next day, this jeep comes coming up to our village. He drops off a package. And they open up the package, and it's got the medicine that they specifically prayed for that previous night. They had a hot water bottle for the child who was dying. And sure enough, there was a teddy bear in there. You know, they look at this package and they realize that it was mailed out 6 months in advance. And later on, they contacted a person asking them what made them think about sending that package at that time and even including a teddy bear. And they thought that that's what the town would need. And it was exactly what they needed at the moment that they needed it. And that girl was able to survive. And she had her teddy bear to comfort herself with. You know, miracles happen every day. It's easy to look at that and say, that's pure coincidence. That just was a complete, you know, luck of the draw kind of thing. Or we could step back and say that was an act of God. He orchestrated that person to put the right medication in, the right supplies in, and even teddy bears in, so that the town could be able to move forward, get healthy, and survive. And so this is the thing I want to really get at is really count your blessings. Actively look at these events in your life, whether it's new animals in your life or maybe even some extra money that you weren't expecting coming your way. Maybe it could even be the parking space right in front of the store you were going to. You know, all these different little gifts that are given to you are from God. And you should really look for them, be mindful of them, and know how they relate to your life and how they relate to your testimony. Because understanding that is going to make a difference between being upright when the chips are down and you have to stand up for your faith and stand up for God, or cowering when times get tough. Now, with certain people in the White House and certain people being elected around the Europe and the UK, I can't guarantee that things will get a lot better, but I can guarantee things can and eventually will get worse. So we need to be really mindful, be willing to stand up when needed, and realize that time is short. So anyways, I'm going to close with a quick prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for today. I pray that you be with us, guide us. Thank you for allowing me to get this message out. Thank you for having Skittles to cooperate for the most part. And I pray that you protect us, Lord. Allow us to stand firm with you when we need to. Allow us to seek you and not give up, not get weary, and do what you need us to do. I pray this in your name. Amen. So thank you for checking in. I hope this is worthy of your time, and I will talk to you later. Bye.